We can take as long as you need. It's no rush. So.
No, we're going. We've got this. All right. Hello. And I'm really excited today. I'm joined today with Professor Daniel Cziczo. He is the department head and professor at Purdue University, specializing in atmospheric chemistry with a specialization in cloud physics. And that's important when we consider global warming because cloud feedbacks are sort of like the big uncertainty in global warming. So he is dialed in on all the arguments related to those uncertainties and fallacies related to those uncertainties, which is really the topic of our conversation today, are fallacy arguments in science, and his background as a climate scientist, seeing all the fallacy arguments that have been spreading with this coronavirus pandemic. So he comes to us from Purdue University. Prior to Purdue, he was an associate professor at MIT and taught courses on atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric physics, cloud physics, and global warming. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today is a little special because I had us on speaker view and that wasn't going back and forth very well. So I'm going to be doing a little manual behind the scenes editing. But before I dive in, I just want to give a little background on why it's important to have this conversation. And I made this schematic here, kind of showing the various things that go into decision making. So starting with, this shows up as backwards on my screen, which is why I paused. Is it showing up as backwards on your screen?
I can actually read it correctly here.
Great. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so, when we consider the things that go into decision making, I just listed a few here. There's experience, which is where I put science. It's the evidence for what happens when we do different things, different beliefs that we have about what we do or do not want, our values. That's also an important thing. Sometimes our experience doesn't coincide with what we actually value, and we choose to decide something based on our values instead of what our experience would inform us. Like, hey, it's important to me to show up for my friends, even though I might get hurt doing that. I don't know, that's an example. And then bias, implicit bias that comes either from our background or our cultural heritage. And then also influence, what our friends are thinking, what our family's thinking, what people that we respect say. And all of these go into decision making, and it's the decisions that then feed into policies, either personal policies of what we're going to choose to do or policies that are made in our government. And so the sideways thing of fallacies is that they can sometimes mask as science. They can sometimes mask as beliefs. And so what, I came into this when I was in graduate school, hearing denialists talk about human-induced global warming as being a fallacy, and really being intrigued by the arguments. And I read Michael Crichton's State of Fear, which is, in my opinion, it was just one of these books that was like totally kept my attention while I was transiting on airplanes, and I was like, oh, this is fun, totally exciting, and so full of fallacy. But it took me, taking a section that was related to my expertise on Antarctic science and going through the different citations that I used in that book, and talking to the authors of those articles and really parsing it out to see what those fallacies are. And so my point in bringing that up is that they can be really persuasive to really smart people, and sometimes it's hard to see what the fallacy is. And so the point of this conversation today is to kind of unpack what fallacy arguments are And Dan, I'm really excited to hear your perspective on this, and especially sort of what you've experienced in this coronavirus pandemic, and how it's related to your experience as a climate scientist and the fallacies that you've experienced as a climate scientist.
Well, first off, it's really fun to have a chat with you today, Rachel. So thank you so much again for having me on. We had a chance to work together many years ago and have continued to be colleagues and friends ever since. And when you came up with the idea for this discussion, I was all in because I just thought it was so timely. And I think one of the reasons I was so excited to be on with you is that over the last several months since the coronavirus pandemic has started, I've had a chance to do a few interviews on climate. And in every one of them, the interviewer has asked a question about similarities between climate science and what we're experiencing with COVID right now. And it is really striking. And there's a few people that have said this before, but the least surprised individuals about misconceptions with COVID are climate scientists, because we've been living through this for the better part of 20 years now. And so I love the flowchart that you brought up at the beginning, as far as our decision-making process goes. Because it's something that we often say in climate, which is people are entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And unfortunately, we sometimes confuse our opinion with what the facts are. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have our opinion, formed on the basis of, as you put it, books or media or things like that are actually, statements of fallacy, as opposed to firm science. And that's a big issue. So, I think, stop me and jump in wherever you would like to, but I think one of the real similarities, the eerie similarities between what we've experienced with climate and what's going on now with COVID is that there's forces behind this, right? So the science is actually pretty well founded. And so I can use climate as a basis for this. A lot of our scientific understanding of things like greenhouse gases and global warming is not modern. But people sort of think that it is, or that we're just having this discussion now. But the basic science, the building blocks, actually date back to the middle of the 1800s. And so as scientists, we've been researching this, we've understood it for over 100 years now. Some of the first attempts at doing a climate sensitivity, how much the Earth is going to warm because of greenhouse gases, were done like in the year 1900, so 120 some years ago now. And yet, when you maybe listen to different sources of media, you would think that we're just discovering these things now. And there are some uncertainties. And as you pointed out in the introduction, my group works with clouds and feedbacks from clouds, and how humans are altering clouds and how they're participating in climate change is uncertain. And that's one of the reasons that we work in it. But at the same time, the building blocks are really worked out, and now we're trying to just sort out the last of the uncertainty so we can project climate into the future. And so, we can sort of ask ourselves, well, why are some groups portraying climate as being this highly uncertain thing? There's a variety of reasons for that. But I think that a lot of it goes back to the economics of it. Climate change is largely due to the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There's other greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is the major one. And carbon dioxide from human sources, the majority of it comes from fossil fuel burning. And so this is energy production. And so it's a big part of our economy. It's a big part of our infrastructure. And so there's real economic and political reasons why you might not want to see a change in power generation. And so for those reasons, you start to see a lot of misconceptions.
And a quick clarification on that, is that short-term economics or long-term economics? Because my understanding is that when looking at economics on longer time scales, there's actually a benefit to addressing climate, right? Okay, just checking.
Yeah, no. I think you're absolutely right. And so maybe a better way to put it would be it's the status quo of economics, right? It's where we have power plants now that are based around fossil fuel combustion, and so I think you're absolutely right. If you look longer term, as we deplete fossil resources, certainly, moving towards renewables and also things like nuclear power generation are going to be much more sustainable. Those are the things that we probably should be looking at. with a 100-year time horizon. But if you're looking at a 1-year or 5-year time horizon, then that equation completely changes. So I think you're absolutely right in bringing that up.
So are there particular fallacy arguments that you've been really familiar with as a climate scientist that you've seen reflected in this pandemic?
Yeah, there's a number of them. And so, one of the interesting things that has been noted in climate is that there's sort of a list, and you could sort of think of, a set of common arguments that are made that are sort of thrown out to say, well, climate change isn't happening, and so then scientists are sort of forced to say, yeah, temperature is rising and this is how we prove it. And then what you can say is something like, well, climate change is happening, but it's not due to human causes. And so then scientists have to go back and say, there is natural climate change, ice ages and interstitial periods, but what we're seeing now is not that. It's not due to the things that cause long-term changes. It's a very rapid change, and it has to be due to something that's happening, now, as opposed to over thousands of years. And then people say, well, it's happening rapidly, but maybe it's something natural, like the sun has changed its power output. And then scientists have to put up a satellite or do observations to do that. So the thing I think that's common between the two is not necessarily that the arguments themselves are the same, but it's this idea that you throw things out that the scientists then have to sort of take their time and disprove. They could be totally ridiculous, but scientists still have to take that time to run through the scientific method and clearly go through and sort of say, no, this argument is not true for this and this and this reason. And so I think that's where a lot of the similarities that we're seeing between climate and COVID are there, which is, you can make a blatantly false statement or a statement that you don't even believe is true, but then there's this enormous amount of effort that has to go into sort of disproving it. And I think we're seeing that in both things. And then one of the insidious things about it is that after you go through your 3 or 5 or 6 different things that are now disproven, people very often go back to the first one. And enough time has elapsed that you just go back and you start the whole process again and say, so for COVID, it's not as bad as everybody's making it out to be. And then, say, oh, okay, it's bad for this and this and this reason. Go through everything else, you don't need to wear masks, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually you just go back to, well, it's not as bad as everybody thinks. And so I think that's a similarity between both what we're seeing now with COVID as well as with climate.
I could see that. I know for me, one of the things that flagged my attention is the false authority argument, and just the wealth of Facebook information shares and videos. A woman from OSHA talking about how wearing masks is kind of bogus, and that really being persuasive. And I found myself, I would receive these various videos and shares and recognizing I'm not an expert in these. It's like, okay, this is an influencer. And so I found myself early on, as we were all trying to suss out what good information was and what our own personal decision-making would be in orienting to this, I found myself taking these information shares and then passing them on to someone who I know is more in the experienced arena of health and being like, what do you think about this? I have 2 friends who were subject to me doing this, and I'll just thank them here. You know who you are. So thank you for bearing with me as you were part of my checking here. And I'd be like, what do you think of? Anyways, the false authority is one that has really kind of shown up in this. One person saying this isn't true, and I even found myself on a Facebook page recently where someone was saying, well, we don't really know if masks are helpful. And I was like, well, actually, at this point, there has been some substantive research on that. And so I was able to share the couple of Nature, peer-reviewed Nature articles. And that's another layer of this, I think, is the difference between a peer-reviewed research article where there's been a methodology and where people in the field have been able to vet what good practices and not good practices and what the credibility is, versus someone posting something on Medium and just sharing an opinion that sounds great and might appeal to a particular belief that we have and validates that belief, but isn't really vetting the experience. I'm getting information that are you still there?
I am.
You are? Okay, I'm getting information on my internet.
You still have me?
Table. Okay. Yeah, I was telling Dan when we were first coming on that being at home, things come up, so people came to repair my refrigerator, and it put me in the position of taking a little step away from my Wi-Fi network source. So we're adapting and evolving as we do in COVID.
It's the remote meeting world that we all live in now.
It is the remote meeting world. Yeah.
Your point is something I couldn't agree with more, and it's another reason I really love the diagram that you brought up at the beginning. And it's something that we can share with your viewers as scientists is really this point that, people have said for a long time that, misinformation can travel at the speed of a mouse click. But science has to be peer reviewed. And you and I have both written scientific papers. And it's a long process. You go through the experiment, you're trying to disprove yourself, you're acquiring as much information as you can, you put it out there to the community, our peers take the time to review it, improve it, and then finally we have a peer reviewed manuscript. If I'm sitting at home and I want to type up something that sounds good, I can just type that and hit enter or click my mouse, and now it's out there for everybody to read. It hasn't been peer reviewed, it hasn't been looked at or corrected by anybody. And yet, unfortunately, there's individuals that weigh these two things equally, and they're really not. I mean, there's just a fundamental difference between them. And so I think that's another similarity between what we're seeing now with COVID and climate, is that scientists are doing this very careful work that takes a long time to do properly, versus people that can be skeptical of this and throw out an opinion, and people kind of think that they're the same thing when they're really not.
Yeah, and so as one thing I'm trying to highlight is these different aspects of what we're seeing in the pandemic. And so one is the power structure with presidents and policies, and is it health or economics, and do we have to decide between the two? And then another, what we're talking about today is personal decision making. Like, how do we manage all the information sources coming in? And I've strongly encouraged people who are watching this to look up fallacy arguments and to become self-educated on what they are and what they look like. They're insidious. I hear scientists use them sometimes. I've even received them when I went through my checks of vetting the information from someone in the medical field. I was passed back a really vague reference of, my friends, my epidemiology friends say, and that is a fallacy argument. It's sort of this vague, like, these people say, and yet, like, it was from someone in the medical field. So there was a little bit of influence there. But yeah, I strongly encourage everybody to look up fallacy arguments and see what they are, so we could become better discerned. The other piece of this is scientists ourselves and our responsibility for this area of relationship. And that's something I want to speak about later, because there's science and there's a space between science, and the space between science is wonderful. It's the fertile ground for future science. And sometimes scientists and people in the medical profession are really quick to disregard stuff that has not been peer reviewed published and isn't in the literature, as not being something that can be factored into decision making. And I see benefit in exploring the space between science, and I can understand why people do that. And so I don't want to discount that area. I just think we need to be discerning in how we approach it and relate to it. So anyways, thank you so much. I'm going to stick with my goal of trying to keep these palatable and not too long. So I will leave it there and look forward to picking this thread up at a future date and carrying it forward. Thank you, Dan.
Rachel, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. And yeah, I mean, it's not the best thing that we want to talk about, which is fallacy arguments. We'd rather talk about, all the science that we're doing. But at the same time, I think it is really important that as you pointed out, different branches of science can really collaborate. We can learn things from each other. In this case, how to battle misinformation and how to try to get the truth across to people that are interested. So thank you.
Yeah.